George Cooper Sr. wasn't the family problem, he was the family sacrifice. For years, the story seemed simple. Sheldon was the misunderstood genius, Mary was the exhausted mother, and George was the loud, imperfect father standing in the way. But that reading only works if you ignore something hiding in plain sight. George spent most of his life giving this family exactly what it needed while receiving remarkably little emotional recognition in return. You remember the arguments, the mistakes, the moments when he lost his temper. The show wants those moments on the surface because they are easy to see. What is harder to see is the pattern underneath. Every time George tried to connect, he entered a household that already had its emotional alliances, its preferred voices, and its unspoken hierarchy. The tragedy is not that George was unloved in any simple sense. They cared about him. But caring about someone is not the same as seeing them, and once a person realizes they are valued more for what they provide than for who they are, something inside them begins to change quietly, permanently, and almost invisibly. That change is the real story we need to investigate today here. The most devastating thing about George Cooper Sr.'s story is that nobody in his family ever sat down and decided to exclude him. It just happened. That is what makes it so uncomfortable to watch once you notice it. If George had been openly hated, the problem would be obvious. The audience would immediately recognize the injustice. But emotional isolation rarely looks like cruelty. More often, it looks like 1,000 ordinary moments that seem harmless on their own. A joke here, a dismissal there, a conversation that begins without you and ends without you. Over time, those moments accumulate until a person starts feeling like a guest in their own life. And that is exactly what happened to George. On the surface, the Cooper household appears balanced. George is the father. Mary is the mother. Sheldon, Missy, and Georgie are the children. Every family member has a role. Every family member has a voice. But if you pay attention to who actually shapes the emotional reality of the home, a different picture emerges. The center of gravity isn't George. It is Mary. More specifically, it is the emotional alliance between Mary, Sheldon, and Meemaw. This alliance isn't malicious. In many ways, it develops naturally. Sheldon requires extraordinary attention. His intellectual gifts create constant challenges that most parents are not equipped to navigate. Mary becomes his primary advocate. Meemaw becomes his protector. Together, they form a support system designed around Sheldon's needs. That sounds reasonable. Until you realize what happens to everyone standing outside that circle. George repeatedly finds himself in the position of reacting to decisions rather than participating in them. Conversations about Sheldon frequently happen before George is informed. Family strategies are discussed without his input. Problems are interpreted through Mary's perspective first, then presented to George afterward. The difference seems small. It is not. In family systems psychology, inclusion isn't measured by physical presence. It is measured by influence. A person can sit at the dinner table every night and still occupy a peripheral role if their perspective rarely changes outcomes. George experiences this constantly. You never noticed it because sitcoms teach you to laugh before you analyze. Think about how often George enters a situation already behind everyone else. The family understands the problem. Mary understands the solution. Meemaw has an opinion. Sheldon has demands, and George is expected to adjust again and again and again. Over time, a subtle message emerges. Your role is not to help define reality. Your role is to accommodate it. That is a dangerous position for anyone, especially a parent, because parents are supposed to feel like authority figures within the family structure. They don't need total control, but they do need a sense that their voice matters. Without that, something called identity erosion begins to occur. Identity erosion happens when a person's role remains necessary, but their individuality becomes increasingly irrelevant. George's paycheck matters, his transportation matters, his coaching job matters. His practical support matters. But George himself, that is where the picture becomes uncomfortable. One of the most revealing patterns in the series is how frequently George's emotional needs are treated as secondary concerns. When Sheldon struggles, the family mobilizes. When Mary struggles, everyone notices. When the children struggle, entire storylines emerge around helping them. But when George struggles, the response is often different. His frustration becomes a character flaw. His exhaustion becomes a punchline. His disappointment becomes background noise. And, because George is a grown man, the audience unconsciously accepts this arrangement. After all, fathers are supposed to handle things. They're supposed to absorb pressure. They're supposed to keep going. That is the cultural assumption operating beneath the surface. The problem is that human beings don't stop needing emotional validation simply because they're adults. George doesn't need constant praise. He doesn't need attention every second. He simply needs evidence that his inner life matters. Too often, that evidence never arrives. The saddest part is that George seems aware of this long before the audience is. Watch how he behaves during family conflicts. He frequently enters conversations already expecting resistance. He often defends his position before anyone attacks it. He anticipates dismissal because dismissal has become familiar. That pattern reflects something psychologists call hypervigilance. Hypervigilance develops when a person becomes accustomed to negative outcomes and starts preparing for them in advance. Instead of entering situations openly, they enter defensively because experience has taught them what usually happens next. George isn't reacting to one disagreement. He is reacting to years of accumulated experiences. Years of feeling slightly outside the emotional center of the family he works so hard to support. And here's the part that changes everything. The family doesn't see it, not because they don't care, because they're used to it. Human beings normalize patterns with alarming speed. What begins as an exception eventually becomes routine. Once a family becomes accustomed to one person carrying emotional burdens quietly, everyone unconsciously starts treating that burden-bearing as part of the person's identity. George becomes the stable one, the resilient one, the one who can take it, the one who doesn't need much. Until eventually nobody asks whether that is actually true. And when nobody asks, a person can disappear emotionally while remaining physically present. That is the contradiction at the heart of George Cooper Sr. He is everywhere in the family's daily life. Yet somehow, he often feels absent from its emotional life. Not because he doesn't care, not because he doesn't try, but because he has gradually been assigned a role that values his function more than his feelings. And once someone starts believing their value comes primarily from what they provide, they're already standing at the edge of a far more painful realization, one that George may have understood long before anyone else did. The most painful relationship in George Cooper Sr.'s life wasn't the one he had with Sheldon, it was the one he had with Mary, because Sheldon could reject George's perspective and still be a child. Mary couldn't. She was the one person in the family who was supposed to see the weight George was carrying. The one person who understood the pressures of raising 3 children, managing financial stress, and holding a struggling household together. More than anyone else, she had access to the version of George that nobody else saw. And yet, again and again, she chose to stand beside him, only when standing beside him was easy. That is what makes their marriage so psychologically complex. Mary absolutely loved George. There is no serious argument against that. She worried about him, protected him, defended him at times, grieved for him. The love was real. The problem is that love and emotional partnership are not the same thing. A person can genuinely love someone while still making them feel profoundly alone. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of George and Mary's marriage. From the outside, many of their conflicts appear straightforward. George wants one thing, Mary wants another. They argue, somebody compromises, life moves forward. But beneath those disagreements lies a recurring pattern. When tension enters the family system, George often becomes the designated source of the problem. Not always, but often enough to matter. Family system psychology uses the term scapegoating to describe a process where one person becomes the default explanation for broader dysfunction. The scapegoat isn't necessarily blamed for everything. Instead, they become the most convenient place to deposit frustration whenever the system is under stress. George occupies that position more frequently than viewers realize. When Sheldon struggles, George is often portrayed as lacking understanding. When family disagreements emerge, George's reactions are frequently examined before anyone questions the conditions that produce those reactions. When conflicts escalate, attention tends to shift toward managing George rather than understanding George. The distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Because there is a profound difference between asking, why is he acting this way, and asking, how do we stop him from acting this way? One seeks understanding, the other seeks control, and George repeatedly finds himself on the receiving end of the second approach. You can see it in the emotional alliances that emerge during family disputes. Mary naturally gravitates towards Sheldon. In many cases, that instinct is understandable. Sheldon requires advocacy. His needs are unusual. His challenges are real. But every alliance creates an opposite side. And George is frequently standing there alone, not because Mary intentionally abandons him, because she unconsciously prioritizes the people she perceives as needing her most. The result is devastating. George becomes the family member expected to absorb disappointment without demanding comfort in return. He becomes the strong one, the stable one, the adult who can handle it. There is a sentence hidden beneath countless interactions in the Cooper household. George will be fine. Nobody says it aloud. Nobody has to. The assumption is everywhere. And assumptions like that are dangerous because they slowly transform a person's suffering into something invisible. Here is the tragedy. George isn't fine. He is exhausted. He is overwhelmed. He is carrying financial pressure, parental responsibility, marital strain, and the growing realization that his emotional needs rank surprisingly low on the household priority list. Yet the family continues functioning as though his resilience is unlimited. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as emotional deprivation, not the absence of love, the absence of sufficient emotional nourishment. A person receives responsibility without support, expectations without validation, demands without recognition. Eventually, they stop asking for what they need because experience teaches them the answer before the question is spoken. George starts displaying signs of exactly that pattern. His complaints become more restrained. His vulnerability becomes less visible. His disappointment becomes quieter. That is not growth. That is adaptation. And adaptation isn't always healthy. Sometimes adaptation is what happens when someone concludes that expressing pain no longer changes anything. Think about that for a moment. One of the central figures holding this family together increasingly behaves like a man who expects his emotional reality to go unnoticed, not because nobody loves him, because love alone isn't enough. People need to feel chosen, defended, prioritized, understood. George occasionally receives those things, but rarely with the consistency he gives them to everyone else. That is why the marriage hurts more on a second viewing. The issue isn't whether Mary loved George. She did. The issue is whether George consistently felt loved in a way that met his emotional needs. Those are very different questions, and the gap between them may explain why George gradually begins carrying himself like a man who has stopped expecting anyone to take his side. Because once a husband feels alone in his marriage, loneliness doesn't stay inside the marriage. It spreads into parenting, into identity, into self-worth, and eventually into something even more heartbreaking. The belief that being needed is the closest thing to being loved that you are ever going to get. The most dangerous wounds in a sitcom are the ones disguised as laughter, because laughter has a remarkable ability to hide emotional truth. When an audience laughs, analysis stops. A joke creates permission not to look deeper. The scene ends, the story moves forward, and nobody asks what that moment might feel like. If it happened in real life, that is why sitcoms can sometimes conceal surprisingly painful dynamics in plain sight. And George Cooper, Sr., may be one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. For years, viewers laughed at George. They were supposed to. The writing encouraged it. The structure depended on it. George was often positioned as the less sophisticated parent, the imperfect husband, the football coach whose common-sense worldview collided with the intellectual chaos surrounding Sheldon. The contrast was funny, sometimes very funny, but comedy becomes revealing when the same target appears over and over again. Because eventually a pattern emerges, and patterns tell the truth that individual moments can hide. Look closely at the kinds of jokes that surround George throughout the series. They aren't random. Many of them focus on the same core themes: his intelligence, his eating habits, his emotional awareness, his ambitions, his parenting decisions, his ability to understand Sheldon again and again. George becomes the family member whose shortcomings are considered safe material for humor. At first, that doesn't seem unusual. Families tease each other. Healthy relationships often include playful mockery. The problem isn't the existence of jokes. The problem is direction. When teasing consistently flows toward one person more than others, it starts functioning differently. It stops feeling like shared humor. It starts feeling like social positioning. In psychology, families often establish unspoken roles. One person becomes the responsible one. Another becomes the caretaker. Another becomes the achiever. Over time, these roles become self-reinforcing. George acquires a particularly uncomfortable role. He becomes the family member everyone is allowed to laugh at. That role comes with hidden consequences, because every joke communicates information, even when nobody intends it to. A joke tells you what traits are valued, what traits are respected, what traits are considered weaknesses, and perhaps most importantly, whose feelings are expected to survive the punchline. Think about how rarely the family pauses after dismissing George. The joke lands. People move on. The conversation continues. His reaction rarely becomes the focus. Why? Because everyone assumes he'll absorb it. That is the expectation. George can take it. George is tough. George isn't sensitive. George doesn't need reassurance, but resilience is not immunity. A person can withstand something and still be hurt by it. A person can laugh along and still feel diminished. A person can pretend not to care while quietly carrying the accumulation of years. That is what makes repeated ridicule so psychologically significant. Its power isn't located in any single moment. Its power comes from repetition. One joke means nothing. 50 jokes become a message. 100 jokes become an identity. And George hears variations of the same message constantly. You are not the smart one. You are not the insightful one. You are not the person people come to for understanding. You are the guy who gets laughed at. You never noticed how lonely that role is because sitcoms train audiences to see it as harmless. But imagine living inside it. Imagine spending years being the reliable provider while also serving as the household's preferred source of comedic relief. Imagine sacrificing for people who instinctively view your mistakes as entertainment. Imagine hearing your weaknesses echoed so often that you begin anticipating them before anyone speaks. That is where humor begins crossing into something darker, something psychologists sometimes call identity reinforcement. Identity reinforcement occurs when repeated social feedback teaches a person who they are supposed to be, not who they actually are, who everyone expects them to be. George receives the same feedback repeatedly. He is the ordinary one, the flawed one, the guy who doesn't quite get it, and eventually even strong people start internalizing narratives they hear often enough, not consciously, quietly. Gradually, the human mind is built for adaptation. If enough people treat you like a caricature, part of you begins wondering whether the caricature is real. That is the hidden cost of becoming the joke. And here is the most heartbreaking part. George often participates in his own diminishing. He laughs, makes a joke back, changes the subject, acts unaffected, which is exactly what many emotionally neglected people learn to do. Because protesting feels embarrassing, defending yourself feels needy, admitting hurt feels dangerous. So instead, you play along. You become a collaborator in your own invisibility, not because you enjoy it, because it hurts less than confronting it. At least in the moment, but pain that isn't confronted doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And by this point in George's story, the accumulation is becoming impossible to ignore, because the family wasn't just laughing at George. They were slowly teaching him exactly what role they expected him to play. And the more sacrifices he made, the more that role began to feel like the only thing anyone truly noticed. The cruelest form of invisibility isn't being ignored. It is being depended on. George's entire life revolved around making sure everyone else's life could function. He worked jobs he didn't love, carried financial burdens he rarely discussed, and accepted compromises that slowly narrowed his own world. Yet the more reliable he became, the less remarkable his sacrifices appeared. What began as generosity became expectation. That is the paradox of invisible labor. The more consistently you provide it, the less people notice it exists. George's value inside the family increasingly became tied to function rather than identity. He drove, he paid, he fixed, he supported, he absorbed. But very few people stopped to ask what George wanted beyond those responsibilities. His dreams became secondary to family survival. And because he loved them, he kept saying yes. What makes this tragic is that acknowledgement isn't a luxury. It is emotional oxygen. Human beings need evidence that their sacrifices are seen. Without that recognition, giving slowly transforms into depletion. You can watch this process happen across the series. George rarely asks for appreciation. He rarely demands gratitude, but that doesn't mean he doesn't need it. The absence of complaint is not proof of contentment. Eventually, George begins carrying himself like a man whose contributions are assumed rather than valued. And once a person realizes they're appreciated mostly when they're useful, a dangerous question begins forming in the background. Would anyone miss me if I stopped giving? The reason George and Missy's relationship feels different is because it was Missy possessed something almost nobody else in the family consistently demonstrated: emotional awareness. Unlike Sheldon, she noticed feelings. Unlike Mary, she wasn't distracted by responsibility. Unlike Georgie, she wasn't consumed by his own struggles. Missy paid attention, and what she saw was a father who spent much of his life standing alone. Their connection wasn't built on shared interests. It wasn't built on intellectual compatibility. It was built on recognition. Missy looked at George and saw a person, not a role. Not a provider, not a problem, a person. That is incredibly important because emotional neglect often creates a strange form of loneliness. People can be surrounded by family and still feel unseen. Missy consistently challenged that loneliness. She laughed with George rather than at him. She understood his frustrations. She recognized unfairness when she saw it. Most importantly, she offered something the rest of the family rarely provided: validation. George didn't need Missy to solve his problems. He needed proof that somebody understood they existed, and Missy gave him that proof. That is why their scenes carry such unusual emotional weight. Beneath the humor is mutual empathy. Two people occupying similar positions inside the family structure. Two people who understood what it felt like to live in Sheldon's shadow. Missy wasn't just George's daughter. She was his witness. Most viewers assume George connected more easily with Missy because she was easier to understand. The truth goes deeper. Missy made George feel respected. That is the difference. Relationships don't survive on love alone. They survive on emotional reciprocity, the feeling that what you give is returned in some meaningful way. George constantly offered Sheldon patience, support, and accommodation. Missy offered George something equally valuable: appreciation. She listened. She noticed. She cared. George never had to prove his worth to Missy. He never had to earn the right to be heard. He didn't need advanced degrees, scientific expertise, or intellectual brilliance. Being her father was enough. Think about how rare that experience must have felt. In so many relationships, George was evaluated through performance. As a husband, as a father, as a provider, as a problem solver. With Missy, he was simply accepted. That acceptance created emotional safety, and emotional safety is the foundation of every meaningful connection. The tragedy is that George found more validation from one daughter than from most of the adults around him. Not because the others didn't care, because Missy paid attention to something everyone else overlooked. George had feelings too. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly feels invisible. It is a gradual process, 1,000 experiences teaching the same lesson. George's realization wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive during a huge argument or life-changing event. It arrived through accumulation. Every dismissal, every joke, every sacrifice that went unnoticed, every moment when somebody needed what he provided but not who he was. Over time, George begins lowering his expectations. He argues less, pushes less, asks less. At first glance, that looks like maturity. It isn't, it is resignation. Psychologists call this learned helplessness. After enough experiences where effort produces the same disappointing outcome, people stop believing their actions can change anything. George starts adapting to emotional disappointment before it happens. He expects not to be heard. He expects not to be prioritized. He expects not to be understood. The saddest part is that he is often right. And once someone begins expecting loneliness, loneliness becomes easier for everyone else to miss, because pain becomes quiet. George's most painful moments aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet ones. The scenes where he briefly lets the mask slip. Moments where frustration turns into honesty. Moments where exhaustion becomes visible. Moments where you realize he understands far more than people give him credit for. Those conversations reveal a man who knows exactly where he stands, not intellectually, emotionally. He knows which opinions carry weight. He knows whose needs come first. He knows how often his perspective gets dismissed. And what makes these moments devastating is how little anger remains. By this point, George isn't fighting for recognition. He is measuring the distance between what he hoped family would feel like and what it actually feels like. That distance is grief, not grief for a death. Grief for an expectation. The expectation that love automatically creates understanding. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes people love you sincerely while failing to truly see you. George begins realizing that truth long before anyone else does. And once he sees it, he can never completely unsee it. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from feeling unseen. Eventually, people stop asking for what they need, not because the need disappears, because hope does. George's later behavior often gets interpreted as emotional distance. But distance isn't always indifference. Sometimes it is self-protection. Every human being has a limit, a point where repeated disappointment becomes too expensive. George approaches that point slowly. His emotional investment becomes more cautious. His expectations become smaller. His willingness to be vulnerable decreases. This isn't apathy. It is burnout, the emotional version of carrying something heavy for so long that your arms eventually give out. And when a father stops fighting to be understood, the loss affects everyone even if nobody notices immediately. The biggest mistake audiences make about George is assuming he stopped caring. He didn't, he stopped expecting. Those are completely different things. Grief doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a man deciding not to start another argument because he already knows how it ends. George still loves his family deeply, but love becomes painful when it isn't matched by understanding. What appears to be passivity is often emotional self-preservation. What appears to be disengagement is often disappointment. And what appears to be indifference is frequently grief wearing a disguise. The tragedy isn't that George stopped loving. The tragedy is that loving stopped feeling safe. This story has no villain. That is why it hurts. Mary didn't wake up trying to neglect George. Sheldon didn't wake up trying to dismiss him. The children didn't wake up trying to take him for granted. Most emotional neglect happens without intention. It emerges from habits, blind spots, competing needs. People become so focused on surviving their own struggles that they stop noticing someone else's. The Cooper family loved George, but love without awareness can still leave scars. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire story. Nobody meant to make George feel alone. They simply became accustomed to him carrying loneliness well. And once a family normalizes someone's suffering, that suffering becomes nearly invisible, even to the people causing it. The moment wasn't a single scene. It was an understanding, a realization built over years. George eventually recognized something devastating. His family loved him, but they didn't always see him. They appreciated his effort more consistently than his humanity. They noticed what he provided more often than what he felt. And those two things are not the same. That realization changes every interaction that comes before it. Every joke, every sacrifice, every dismissal, every lonely dinner table conversation. George wasn't discovering hatred. He was discovering imbalance, and imbalance can hurt just as deeply, because the most painful question isn't, do they love me? It is, would they know who I am if I stopped giving them what they need? George spent years confronting that question, and he never received a completely satisfying answer. When most people finish Young Sheldon, they remember Sheldon. After a second viewing, many remember George because George represents something painfully familiar. The parent who keeps showing up, the person whose sacrifices become routine, the family member everyone depends on but rarely studies closely. His tragedy isn't dramatic enough to announce itself. There are no grand speeches. No emotional monologues explaining exactly what he feels. That is why it lingers. You have to discover it. And once you do, the entire series changes. George stops looking like the flawed sitcom father. He starts looking like a man carrying far more emotional weight than anyone realized. A man who loved deeply, sacrificed constantly, and spent much of his life wondering whether anyone truly understood what those sacrifices cost. That is why his story stays with people. Not because it is unique, because it isn't. Every family has someone like George, someone whose love became so reliable that everyone stopped noticing it until it was gone.